December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor is burning. Battleships are sinking. And while America is reeling, leaders in Tokyo believe they've just set the United States on a path to defeat. It sounds impossible today. Japan never expected to conquer America. It believed something far more achievable, that one devastating blow could convince the United States the war simply wasn't worth fighting. There was just one problem. The strategy that was supposed to win the war was already fatally flawed before the attack even began. Japan's leaders just didn't know it yet. By the end of this video, you'll see Pearl Harbor differently. Not as the moment Japan gained the upper hand, but as the moment its entire path to victory quietly began to unravel. The problem nobody in Tokyo wanted to solve. Most people assume Japan simply miscalculated America's military strength. That explanation feels satisfying, but it doesn't fully account for what Japanese planners were actually working with. Japan's leadership understood the numbers. Its own naval strategists had studied American industrial output for years. Some historians argue that Japan's military command knew, with reasonable precision, that a prolonged war against the United States was unwinnable in conventional terms. So why attack at all? Because the plan was never designed to win a prolonged war. It was designed to avoid one. This is the first shift in understanding. Japan's strategy wasn't built around defeating America. It was built around convincing America to walk away before the real fight even started. The knockout blow theory. Japanese naval doctrine had been shaped for decades by a single idea: win decisively, early, and force the enemy to the negotiating table before their strength could be mobilized. This wasn't unprecedented thinking. Japan had used a similar approach against Russia in 1904, striking first and negotiating from a position of strength once the shock had set in. Contemporary reports suggest this earlier success shaped how Japanese planners viewed a future conflict with the United States. The theory was simple: cripple the Pacific Fleet in a single strike. Remove America's ability to project power into the Pacific for at least a year. Use that window to seize resource-rich territory across Southeast Asia. Then, when the United States finally rebuilt enough strength to respond, offer a negotiated peace that left Japan in control of what it had already taken. It didn't seem important at first, but the entire plan depended on one untested assumption: that a democratic, war-weary public would prefer a quiet settlement over a long and costly war for territory it barely understood. That assumption would turn out to be the single biggest miscalculation of the entire Pacific War. There was also a quieter assumption sitting underneath it, one rarely discussed outside academic circles. Japanese planners believed geography itself would work in their favor. The Pacific was vast. Supply lines from the American mainland were long. A defensive perimeter built across island chains and fortified bases, the thinking went, could be made expensive enough that Washington would eventually see the cost of continued fighting as not worth the prize. This wasn't an irrational idea. It had worked in different forms for other powers defending extended frontiers throughout history. What it failed to account for was the scale of what America could throw at that perimeter once its industrial base was fully mobilized. A defensive strategy built to make war costly only works if the opponent's capacity to absorb cost has a ceiling. The United States, as it turned out, barely had one. What Pearl Harbor actually accomplished? The attack itself was, in narrow military terms, effective. Within about 2 hours, the battleship fleet anchored along Battleship Row had been devastated. Several ships were sunk or badly damaged. Casualties were severe, but a knockout blow requires more than damaged ships. It requires removing the enemy's ability to fight back, and that's where the plan quietly began to fail. The attack missed the fuel storage depots sitting largely undefended near the harbor. It missed the dry docks and repair facilities that would soon rebuild much of the damaged fleet faster than anyone expected. It missed the submarine base entirely, and most critically, it missed the aircraft carriers. They were at sea during the attack, out of position by circumstance rather than warning. Within a year, those same carriers would carry the fight directly back across the Pacific. This created a situation that wasn't immediately visible on December 7th. Japan had struck hard, but it hadn't struck the parts of the base that mattered most for long-term recovery. The fleet was wounded. It wasn't dead. Miscalculation that mattered most. Here's the part the knockout blow theory never accounted for. Japanese planners expected a shocked, divided American public to pressure its government toward a quick settlement. Some historians argue this expectation was shaped by Japan's own political culture, where public sentiment could shift rapidly under pressure. The United States in late 1941 was genuinely divided. Isolationist sentiment was strong. Entry into another world war was deeply unpopular in large parts of the country. Pearl Harbor didn't confirm that division, it erased it. Instead of fracturing American resolve, the attack unified it almost overnight. What had been an argument about whether to fight became, within days, a a near-total consensus about how completely the fight needed to be won. Recruitment stations were overwhelmed. Industrial mobilization accelerated at a pace few had predicted. The psychological outcome Japan needed didn't happen. The opposite one did. The oil problem behind the attack. To understand why Japan took this risk at all, it helps to step back to what triggered the crisis in the first place. By 1941, the United States had imposed an oil embargo on Japan, cutting off roughly 80% of its fuel imports. For a nation with almost no domestic oil production, and a military built around naval and air power, this wasn't a diplomatic inconvenience. It was an existential threat to Japan's ability to continue operating at all. Japanese planners viewed Southeast Asia, with its oil fields in the Dutch East Indies, as the only viable solution. But securing that region meant confronting American, British, and Dutch interests in the Pacific simultaneously. Pearl Harbor, in this light, wasn't the primary objective. It was a preemptive strike meant to clear the way for a resource-securing campaign further south. The logic was almost mathematical. Remove the American fleet from the equation long enough to seize what Japan needed to survive as an industrial and military power. It's a rational calculation on paper, but it depended entirely on the window staying open long enough, and on the United States eventually accepting the new map without a prolonged fight. The transport problem nobody solved. Even where the resource strategy worked in the short term, a deeper structural issue undermined it. Japan could seize oil fields. Getting that oil back to the home islands was a different challenge entirely. As the war progressed, American submarine campaigns began targeting Japan's merchant marine fleet with increasing effectiveness. Tankers moving oil from the Dutch East Indies toward Japan became primary targets. Later analysis indicates that by the middle years of the war, losses to merchant shipping had begun outpacing Japan's capacity to build replacement vessels. This created a strange and largely invisible crisis. Japan could control the oil fields on a map, while its war machine at home slowly starved for fuel anyway. The resource had been captured, it just couldn't reliably get where it needed to go. It's one of the more overlooked dynamics of the Pacific War. A nation winning territorial objectives while quietly losing the logistical war beneath them. The numbers that decided everything. This is where the story stops being about strategy and starts being about arithmetic. The United States entered the war with a manufacturing base unlike anything else on Earth. Once that capacity shifted to military production, the gap between the two nations widened at a pace Japan's planners had not fully modeled. By 1944, US aircraft production for that single year alone exceeded Japan's total aircraft output for the entire war. Over the course of the conflict, the United States launched around 147 aircraft carriers of various classes. Japan launched approximately 18. This wasn't a difference in skill or resolve. It was a difference in industrial ceiling. Japan's shipyards, steel production, and skilled labor force were simply operating within a much smaller structural capacity than America's one that had barely begun to scale by the time the war reached its later years. There's a detail that puts this gap into sharper focus. American shipyards on the West Coast were completing new destroyer escorts and Liberty ships in a matter of weeks, sometimes days, using assembly techniques borrowed from the automotive industry. Japan's shipbuilding, by contrast, remained largely dependent on smaller yards, skilled craftsmen, and supply chains that grew more fragile as raw materials became harder to secure. Two industrial philosophies were colliding, and only one of them was built for a war of endurance. Steel tells a similar story. American steel production during the war years was measured in tens of millions of tons annually. Japan's total wartime steel output across the entire conflict fell far short of what the United States could produce in roughly a single year. Every ship, every plane, every piece of armor plating traced back to that same underlying constraint.
The replacement equation.
Early in the war, individual battles could still be close. Skilled Japanese pilots and well-trained crews often outperformed their American counterparts in the opening engagements of the Pacific campaign. But skill doesn't scale the way industrial output does. Every aircraft the United States lost in battle could often be replaced within weeks. Every experienced pilot lost could be backfilled by an expanding training pipeline supported by enormous domestic resources. Japan's replacement pipeline, by contrast, grew thinner as the war continued. Fewer aircraft, fewer trained pilots, fewer ships arriving to replace the ones sinking beneath the Pacific. This is what turned the war from a series of battles into a war of attrition. And attrition, mathematically, favored the side that could rebuild faster than it lost. That side was never Japan. It didn't seem decisive in 1942. By 1944, it had become close to a mathematical certainty. The moment the strategy quietly failed. If there's a single point where Japan's entire theory of victory collapsed, It isn't a battle. It's a realization that seems to have arrived too late for it to matter. The plan had assumed a short war, a shocked public, and a negotiated peace. Instead, Japan got a unified adversary, an intact industrial base, and a fleet that rebuilt faster than expected. Some historians argue that Japanese commanders privately recognized the shifting odds well before 1945, but structural and political pressures within the military made a reversal of course extraordinarily difficult. Once the machinery of total war had been set in motion, walking it back required admitting a miscalculation few were willing to voice. So the war continued, even as the numbers behind it became increasingly unfavorable with each passing year. Zooming out, go back to the opening assumption. Most explanations of Pearl Harbor focus on shock, ambition, or aggression. Those aren't wrong, exactly, but they miss the structural reality underneath the decision. Japan's leadership wasn't chasing conquest for its own sake. It was chasing a narrow, fragile theory that a single devastating strike could force a democratic nation into a quick settlement before its true capacity could be brought to bear. That theory required nearly everything to go right. The fuel depots needed to stay untouched. The carriers needed to be caught in port. The American public needed to fracture rather than unify. None of those conditions held. What began as a calculated gamble to avoid a long war ended up guaranteeing one. A war shaped less by any single battle than by shipyards, oil tankers, and production lines thousands of miles from the front. If this changed how you see World War II, there's more to explore.